Yeah.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us for another conversation on Rumi. When people ask about Rumi Forum, I say two things. Rumi is our inspiration and Forum is our format. So this evening will exactly be that. The content is about Rumi, and we hope to enjoy a conversation around the theme. So our speaker this evening is the author of the book that we're going to talk about, Sarah Snyder. Sarah Snyder has been a professional writer and editor since 1991. She has worn hats as a newspaper columnist and reporter, technical writer, writing instructor, communications manager, and consultant, blogger, and book author. So keeping busy, Sarah. With humor and insight, she inspires others through the telling of her experiences to examine what it means to live a meaningful life. Her blog, lunarivervoices.com, focuses on self-care and retreats. She also participates in oral storytelling about her personal experiences, which constitutes the very story in this book. Sarah is the author of 3 nonfiction books and numerous newspaper and magazine articles. Her books include The Value of Your Soul, Rumi Verse for Life's Annoying Moments. The other book is Plant Trees, Carry Sheep, a woman's spiritual journey among the Sufis of Scotland. And the other book is Scenic Driving, Montana. This year, she will also publish 2 more books, With Yourself Solo Retreats, a handbook for creating a space, setting an intention, and getting the self-care you deserve, and another spin-off or her memoir about animal stories. So more coming, and we're looking forward to it, Sarah. I'm just looking forward to hosting you in future occasions, and the floor is yours.
Hey, thank you very much, Ibrahim. Hello and welcome, everyone. Shalom, salam alaikum. Thank you for zooming in for a presentation of my latest book. You can see the cover of it there, The Value of Your Soul, Rumi Verse for Life's Annoying Moments. And I'd like to thank the Rumi Forum for hosting this event, and Ibrahim Anli, who's the president of the Rumi Forum, the director, for his support. And I'm so delighted to have every one of you here. Some of you I know, and many of you I'm guessing I don't know. So hello to old friends and welcome to new friends. I wanted to say, just in appreciation for your support, I'm offering everyone on this call the option of buying a signed copy of both of my books for $2 off the cover price plus taxes and shipping. And if you live in Northern Virginia, you can also buy the books at Reston's Used Bookshop in Reston, Virginia. You can pick it up at the store, and they'll also ship it to you for a small postage fee. It's also available on Amazon and bookshop.org or any brick and mortar store by order. And don't worry, if you are concerned about the word used in the name, you will get a new copy. They can order, they will have new copies on hand for you. And you can also order it directly from me if you like. So what's the plan for the next hour? Well, I'm going to introduce you to this book, and I'm going to read the first chapter from it. It'll be short, and I'm going to answer questions. And because this is the Rumi Forum, I'm also like to get a short discussion going about Rumi's poetry. Some of you may be very familiar with Rumi, and others of you may not be at all. If you don't want to ask questions live, you can always type them into the comment section, into the chat on the right-hand side of your Zoom window at any time. And then I'll ask my wing pilots here to filter through those for me at the end. So let's get started. Well, when I first set out to write this book in late 2019. My intention had been to address some of humanity's common frustrations and annoyances. I wanted to do this by offering some of my own experiences as lessons. And I wanted to share what I've learned and how I've coped. And so, in a nutshell, The Value of Your Soul is a collection of some of these short real life stories where something annoying or infuriating or even emotionally painful happens. And I learn from it, and I have some guidance to share about these types of situations that people often find themselves in. And I know in my experience, I have spent a lot of time agonizing about my experiences instead of seeing them for what they really were, and that is just an experience. And knowing now that I have the choice to respond in any given situation in any way I want. But oftentimes, historically, I've chose to spend a lot of unnecessary emotional energy, which in turn kept me orbiting in this area of discontent and sometimes absolute misery on some level. So, much of our suffering, of the type that we can control anyway, involves a handful of key feelings and behaviors. And in my book, I identify these as, and these will sound familiar to you, expectation and control, resentment, disappointment, impatience, vulnerability, fear, and isolation. These are all the great things, right? Well, these feelings and behaviors can get us into trouble if we're not vigilant. And I call them the stumbling blocks of the ego. And we trip over them all the time throughout our lives, but that's okay because we're human and life happens. But for that reason, instead of thinking of these feelings and behaviors as negative, I like to think of them as teaching feelings and behaviors. So when one of them crops up, it can be a lesson for us, right? It's the potential for personal growth. And I've subtly organized my book into sections that speak to these universal emotions and behaviors. So the stories are in my book are lessons based on them. But they're also stories about love and forgiveness and finding a better way to respond to what life dishes up. And so I want readers to feel less isolated or less bad about themselves or less like, why does this stuff always happen to me? And I do this by posing questions for readers to consider and suggestions for soothing these unpleasant circumstances. Well, like I said, I started writing this book in 2019, and then 2020 happened. So, although The Value of Your Soul deals with, what I call life's garbage, the stories in this book sometimes to me feel kind of quaint now in the face of what we've been through and are still going through on a global scale. And sometimes I'm just think, yeah, I really just want to go back to dealing with these sort of issues that seem minor to us now, like, people getting under our skin or, whatever, instead of having to deal with true existential questions like, is our species even going to be alive in 2 years? So, how do we deal with this pain and suffering? Because we are really experiencing some truly tragic situations right now. And we know if we're not ourselves, we know people or have heard about people who are really suffering quite tragically right now. But even before a global pandemic flattened us, there was this underlying fear in America in particular. Of course, that's the experience I'm coming from. And it goes without saying that we do live in these scary times, but there's been this underlying fear of, terrorist attacks and this random serious violence and the chronic fear experienced by people of certain nationalities, certain skin tones, gender identities, religious beliefs, and they've been persecuted in some way by those who believe erroneously that some people are better than others. And we have really seen how insidious and damaging this can be. So I wanted to address kind of those things in my book. Now, I know this is about Rumi, but I'm going to introduce you to another man just very briefly. And that is because I want to use a quote of his. And this is a man called Sir Thomas Browne. And he was an English polymath and writer from the 17th century. And you will probably recognize some of this quote. And he's the one who's this quote is attributed to: "Charity begins at home, is the voice of the world, yet is every man his greatest enemy." So charity begins at home could mean take care of your family first before reaching out to others. It could mean teach your children charity and the world will improve exponentially for every child who has learned to be charitable. It can mean those things. It can also mean, and for me, this is kind of how I look at it, charity begins at home means take care of your own needs first. Now, that sounds selfish, but it isn't when your ultimate intention is to cultivate your best self, your true nature, which is love. And taking care of your needs first is about being kind to yourself, loving yourself, forgiving yourself. And it includes having a deep understanding of who you really are and knowing what makes you tick, also knowing what ticks you off, and knowing your purpose and what truly matters to you. And it involves letting go of those attitudes and emotions and behaviors that I mentioned earlier that keep us stuck in disharmony and that keep us from being the real love that we are. And this necessarily means changing our response to things that make you feel miserable. So the second half of this phrase, "yet is every man his greatest enemy," describes how we sabotage ourselves when we practice these things like resentment, or when we try to control others or things that are outside of our control, or when we have unrealistic expectations, when we're impatient, when we're frequently disappointed. We are our greatest enemy when we allow fear to rule ourselves and we allow others to take advantage of our vulnerability. We are also our greatest enemy when we feel isolated, or worse, when our behaviors isolate others. So, in my book, I try not to get too heavy-handed. Instead, I keep it lighthearted enough to hopefully to make you chuckle, while also attempting to nudge you towards some different way of thinking, of flipping the script, as I call it, of responding to experiences that you have. And I use humor to do this because it's a great way to cope when life opens its junk box and dumps it on you. So I don't think anyone would argue that 2020 was the most difficult year globally of our lives. And we've suffered high amounts of stress, which many of us still and will continue to suffer from, induced by this virus and unemployment and all the uncertainty. We don't know what's next. And here in America, in particular, and I know around the world, but again, America is my experience, we have a lot of work to do to rid ourselves of the long infection of viruses of injustice and inequality, just for starters. And for us to heal all this stuff, this is all big stuff. For us to heal it, it's essential that we work on ourselves first. And that's what my main theme is here, really. We must strive to become better selves as individuals first, I believe, before we can reach out to others, or even simultaneously. But we really need to work on ourselves to set an example of how we can live, set an example for others about living, more harmoniously. So before we can heal the nation, we need to heal ourselves. Charity begins at home. And now that we're spending more time at home with our families, what better opportunity to practice things like patience and acceptance and get rid of expectation and our tendency to control others, and instead practice more kindness and stop harboring this resentment and disappointment and learn to be better at accepting what is. And being charitable to yourself, like I said, involves flipping the script so that the maddening and annoying things become the teaching, so that doubt becomes self-confidence, even in the face of uncertainty. And we don't have to know what happens next in order to be content or to rest easy. If you take care of yourself, the future will take care of itself, and you'll be in a better position to cope with what does come next. So the title of my book comes from Rumi, and he says, if you know the value of every article of merchandise, but you don't know the value of your own soul, it will all have been pointless. Think about that for a minute. So our survival as individuals and as humanity depends on knowing the value of our souls and being good to ourselves, as Rumi asks us to be. So those of you who have read my memoir, this is a cover of my memoir, Plant Trees Carry Sheep, A Woman's Spiritual Journey Among the Sufis of Scotland. You will recognize the stories in The Value of Your Soul because this book, my latest book, is a spin-off of my memoir. For those of you who haven't read my memoir, it's about my 2-year experience living and working at a spiritual retreat in Scotland. And I was a volunteer on the 200-acre estate, which required spending most of my time outside in mostly bad weather doing a lot of manual labor. And when you mix that up with living communally with all kinds of people from all over the world, sharing bedrooms and bathrooms and eating meals together and sometimes sharing the television remote control, and then the subtitle of my book becomes obvious about For Life's Annoying Moments. You have plenty of opportunities in those situations to get annoyed. So the difference between my memoir and this new book, The Value of Your Soul, is that my new book is composed of short teaching stories. So I take stories and I boil them down to their essence of what happened, what I learned from it. If you're familiar with the chicken soup stories, this book is sort of like that, only I'm calling this lamb stew for the annoyed soul instead of chicken soup. So if you want the full details, you can read about them in my memoir. Well, I'll just describe the book, and then I'm going to read you the first chapter, and then we'll get a discussion going. So each chapter here's a picture of chapter 12. Each chapter is set up with what I call an annoyance that directly relates to an experience I had during my 2 years living and working on this retreat in Scotland. So, and then it also has a translation of that annoyance because the annoyance is quirky and unique to me. So that I translate it to an everyday experience that most people can relate to. And I'll give you an example of that in just a minute. And each chapter also includes a snippet of a Rumi poem. So that's where Rumi comes in. And then finally, there's this short story that I call Unpacking It, about what happened and what I learned from it. And I include just a few reflective questions and suggestions for flipping the script, from looking at the situation from a different perspective. So for example, even if you have never had the experience of hauling manure to the point where your back goes out and the trailer breaks that you hauled it in, you can probably relate to having failed to see the inevitable consequences of potentially harmful actions. So that would be an example of an annoyance and then a translation. Or you also may not know how annoying it is to continuously patch sections of miles upon miles of wire fencing that you thought you had fixed before. And that's what this chapter is when you're forever mending fences, chapter 12. So it feels like you're just, the translation is, it kind of feels like you're covering the same old ground over and over again and getting nowhere. So those are just two examples of my unique experience with a common translation that most people could probably relate to. So in other words, we've all had the experience of being annoyed when people let us down or don't pull their weight, or when things don't go as planned or as expected. And readers may recognize themselves in some ways in how I reacted to the situations. So basically, I gave these situations more power over me than I should have. And if you're that way, you know, maybe next time this happens to you, try some of these suggestions for turning things around. You can also see here an illustration at the top of the chapter, and pictures say a lot. And because my chapters deal with these odd situations, it helps readers get a visual. And the artist for this book was Simon Blackwood, and he's a professional artist who lives in Scotland, and he is involved in the Braemar community. That's the community where I lived. It's actually a fictitious name, but that's what we're going with for right now. So he's intimately familiar with the retreat where I lived, as well as the landscape and the work that I did there. So the tone and the feel of these drawings are really spot on and whimsical. So why Rumi? Well, I chose to apply what Rumi had to say about the meaning of life in his poetry and his prose for two reasons. First, I'm a huge fan of his work. He is my go-to when I need a reminder that I am a soul in a body who longs to live a spirit-centered life, trying to escape from the ego as much as I possibly can. Rumi's works really do deal with life's annoyances and the distractions that people throughout the ages have wrestled with. And so I find his words inspirational, and he also really had a sense of humor. I think of Rumi really as the original hippie. I mean, this guy, he's writing poetry. Some of it is very raw and earthy. He talks a lot about food and you know, muck and just getting in there, and he's spreading the word about love. So, I mean, he is the original hippie. And the second reason I chose Rumi is because the Braemar community, where this book draws its stories from, studies Rumi among the inspired writings of other folks. So part of it is I wanted to introduce Rumi to people who might not be familiar with his work, and also because Rumi is inextricably linked to the Braemar community. Now, some of you on this call may be unfamiliar with Rumi. And if you are, I'll just say really quickly, he was a 13th century Persian poet, Islamic scholar, and Sufi mystic, among other things. And my book does have a reference section that includes some of Rumi's books of poetry and prose to get you started. I'm going to let the Rumi experts on this call speak about Rumi later when we get to the Q&A and discussion section. So with this book, I really hope to encourage readers to see the value of their own souls and to understand their personal wealth, and that is the wealth of your existence. And our value is not in our material possessions or our social status or any physicality that we exhibit. So what is that? Well, for me, I take at least 10 minutes every day. It's usually closer to 30, but I recommend to people in the blogging that I do to take 10 minutes every day just to quiet the mind and focus on the supreme force of love, and to ask yourself questions about who you truly are and why you're here, and then just listen for the answers. And they may come right away, they may not. They may come when you're washing dishes or going for a walk or doing whatever. But doing that, then you'll begin to understand the value of your soul. And I truly believe that this is where the healing begins for all of us. We can't heal our families, our communities, our country, or the world until we heal ourselves, until we know and really understand and accept the value of our own souls. So I'm going to read the first chapter of my book just to give you a taste. And in the book's introduction, I summarize the reason why Braemar exists, and I give a little bit of information about what I did there. So I think in this first chapter, sometimes I read another chapter and some of the information in it is not quite clear to the audience because they haven't read the introduction, but I'm just going to stick with the first chapter tonight. So it won't matter if you don't know kind of the backstory. And while I'm reading, I'm going to play a loop of images that were all taken at Braemar. So you're going to see pictures of the community living together and working together, cooking, relaxing, and then images of the place itself and the surrounding landscape. So please enjoy these as I read. So let me just get started here. And this is a picture of the house. So chapter 1, the annoyance is when you volunteer to plant trees, but end up mucking out chicken coops. And the translation of this is plans change. I think we've probably all experienced that. The Rumi verse that I chose for this is a very long poem, and I kind of took snippets from sections of this. And so it goes, inside each of us, there's a continual autumn. Our leaves fall and are blown out over the water. Very little grows on jagged rock. Be ground, be crumbled, so wildflowers will come up where you are. You've been stony for too many years. Try something different. Surrender. And here's the unpacking it section. When my desperately bored with life soul first reached out to Braemar from my home in Montana to offer my services in exchange for room and board, they invited me to come plant trees. My initial contact was through a man named William, the manager of the estate grounds. What I didn't know was that 11,000 trees had already been planted that previous April, and an additional 6,000 trees were going to be planted the following April. So when I arrived in September, ready to plant trees, William told me the project was another 6 months away. Well, what am I supposed to do in the meantime? I asked him. His response was something along the lines of, oh, there's plenty to do. You can bake bread, you can chop firewood, you can clean toilets, or do whatever needs doing. That's how it is around here. At that same time, I also learned that William would soon be returning home to Australia, so Braemar would have a new estate manager. The new guy, Trevor, would be sort of like my boss, since he was going to be in charge of all the groundskeeping and the forestry work. Well, apparently, they had assumed that I would take the role of Trevor's assistant. It took me several minutes to recover from the initial shock of this news, after which I learned what the role would entail. Braemar had small livestock that needed looking after. They had firewood to harvest. They had a vegetable garden to revive from the dead, fences to mend, and all manner of miscellaneous whatever needs doing. The position didn't excuse me from any potential toilet cleaning, however, because Braemar truly was a pitch-in place. Even though we had volunteers to do all this work, sometimes you just clean toilets. The toilet cleaning of animals, however, was front and center for me. I could have chosen to leave. I could have chosen to return home with my tail between my legs after having announced to God and country that I was moving to Scotland, and don't be surprised if I end up staying there for the rest of my life. Or I could stay and muck out chicken coops. I chose the muck. To my surprise, that choice transformed my life in ways I never dreamed of. I tried something different. I surrendered. Oh, surrender. That word used to really stick in my craw because I interpreted it as giving up or giving in. However, I am slowly making peace with surrender, which I now see more as giving up trying to control situations. It's also about accepting new opportunities when they present themselves because sometimes plans change. Typically, most people aren't fans of change. We like knowing what to expect. We find comfort in routine and certainty. Even if we don't like that routine that we're stuck in, at least it's familiar. We do not like being taken off guard because we don't like surprises unless it's a lottery win. If change and the unexpected scare you, buckle up because the only certain thing in life is change. One day we're going to our favorite restaurant or visiting friends or vacationing on the beach, and the next we're on global lockdown because of a deadly pandemic. Try looking at it this way. Sometimes you're given what you need, not what you think you want. Change can improve your life or situation. Change can lead to better health. Change can lead to deeper relationships or even fun. I reluctantly accepted my altered invitation at Braemar, and in doing so, I learned a lot about myself, others, the world, and my place in it. I had to wade through lots of crap, chicken and otherwise, and that was entirely the point. It got me to a better place in myself. I learned to surrender to opportunities, even if they hadn't been part of the initial plan. I learned to accept that change happens, and how I respond to it makes all the difference to the outcome. Acceptance of change uses a lot less emotional energy and often results in much grander outcomes than I had imagined. Rumi talks about the continual autumn in us, our fallen leaves blown out across the water. In other words, life is constantly changing. Something is always dying away to make room for the new. Without change, we can't have spring wildflowers or new forests. Being willing to be fertile ground means being open to change. You never know. It could lead to amazing transformation. So that is the first chapter. And I'm going to just kind of let these slides roll for a second here. They're almost done. I'm going to ask Ibrahim, has anybody typed any questions in the sidebar?
Not yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
So here, let's I'm going to stop sharing just for a minute here, and I'd like to open up the conversation. Does anybody have any questions about the book itself? And if anybody has read the book, I would love to hear what you had to say about it. Hopefully,
I have a quick question.
Yes.
In the beginning of your conversation, you said how we can get the signed copy of your book. You mind repeating it again?
Yeah, I'm going to show a slide about that again. Is that okay, Sami?
Yes.
Can I do that? Okay. I'll do that at the end, so you will definitely be able to see that.
Yes, I would definitely like to have it signed by you.
Okay, certainly. Has anybody? Yeah, feel free to come off mute and to come back on your video. We've got 25 minutes, and I want to open up some discussion. I do have some questions and some discussion things, but I wanted to ask if anybody has any questions about the book. Now, I do see some comments in the chat. Oh, okay. Anybody? Nobody wants to speak up. Okay.
Oh. Sarah. Yeah. So thank you very much for flipping and making annoyances into windows of rediscovery. I've read the book, and I had the privilege to write a review, which appears in the book, and you bring Rumi into the very heart of our day-to-day wrestles with the surprises of life, which there are plenty, which there are no shortage of, including annoyances. And I observed in the way you constructed, I observed Rumi really helping you negotiate with life itself, almost to the extent of, maybe that's not the best word for a mystic, but almost you are demystifying Rumi and bringing it like right into the next chair, consulting you and walking hand in hand with you, then almost like saying like, okay, I'm trying to mend this fence, come help me. So that's my very, overarching and impression, which I'm happy to share with the audience to get the ball rolling. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Ibrahim. One of my biggest takeaways from my Scottish experience was being taught to let go of expectation. This is a huge stumbling block for me, to say the least. So letting go of what I expected to happen, the outcome, what I expected the outcome to be, what I expected people to be, and how I expected them to behave or think or feel. This was the single most freeing, self-loving act I had ever taken on when I started to learn about this. And I'm still working on it, but I'll tell you, my 2 years at this place really just completely pulled the rug out from under me about, you think you're in charge? You think you know what's coming next, or you think, you know what other people should be doing or whatever. Forget it, sister. This doesn't work this way. And in the book, I talk about expectation being the gateway to disappointment, because expectation really is about control, right? And so that's another major takeaway for me from this experience, and by far the most powerful of the stumbling blocks. In other words, the teaching behavior for me. And Rumi reminds us that we are not in control, right? God is, or if you like, love is. So that was a huge thing for me. Now, personally, Rumi invites me to know that I am not the outward appearance and all of its trappings. So Rumi just takes you right in. So he says, this universe is not outside of you. Look inside yourself. Everything that you want, you already are that. And he talks a lot about how we are the universe, but we still insist on living small and living our lives through the ego instead of the spirit. And about, he talks about, we were born with wings, but we don't use them. We never fly. Why is that? And he tells readers that they are loved with no uncertain amount of lecturing. I call it Rumi shaking, because he doesn't suffer the willfully ignorant or lazy, right? He says something about ignorance being a prison, and, knowing is the palace. So like Rumi just grabs you by the shirt collar and shakes God's love right into your bones, and, reminds you that all the treasures are inside of you. They're not adorning your physical manifestation, and they're not found in your bank account or in your possessions. And he's always asking us, why are you so enchanted with this world and all of these things, material things in the world, when the gold mine, is here, it's within you. So for those of you who are not new to Rumi, I'm going to invite you in this conversation to, what are some of the ways that his poetry and prose and teachings are relevant, like 800 years after his time, if anybody wants to speak to that? Ibrahim, you did say something already about that, but anybody else have any commentary on how we can use Rumi, apply Rumi in a contemporary world?
I'm happy to say a few words about
Please.
that, Sarah. One of the things you said just now in your comments about the universe as opposed to functioning in a narrower psychological space, which is ego bound. One of the issues which is always relevant, whether it is in Rumi's era, which was in the later part of the Crusades, where people were carving each other up across religious terrains. And the period of the Crusades, of course, is not limited to a Christian Muslim, it's also very clearly a Muslim Muslim and Christian Christian and Christian Jewish and Muslim Jewish kind of era with respect to this phenomenon. And when one thinks historically about that kind of faith-based war making, which means that it's war that is associated with faith-based politics, and one realizes that faith-based politics is faith based on the ego, because it's my ego that causes me to say, and perhaps the insecurities that are embedded within my ego that causes me to say, my faith is the only correct form of faith and yours is wrong. And one of the profound things about Rumi, and it is consistent through his writing, is that that's not the way God thinks. And if you think yourself a person of faith, and therefore think yourself engaged and interested in God, and particularly if you think of yourself as someone who loves God and assumes and hopes and believes that God loves you, then not to love all of humanity because God created all of humanity is a contradiction in terms for you. And the only reason you allow that contradiction is because of your ego. And of course, since the whole idea for the mystic, for a Sufi, like Rumi as a Sufi, is to empty oneself of self to be filled with God. So often his poetry is written as if it is God speaking, because it is God speaking, as if he is merely the conduit through which it is God speaking, who says, I'm not from the East, I'm not from the West, I'm not Christian, I'm not Muslim, I'm not Jewish, I'm not Hindu, I'm not Buddhist, I'm all of it and none of it, reflects the absence of ego, so that the ego has been replaced by godness, and therefore permits one to be a universalist, which doesn't at the same time deny one's commitment to be this kind of Muslim versus that kind, this kind of Jew versus that kind, this kind of Christian versus that kind, and so on. One can be both. Rumi doesn't give up being a Muslim, but at the same time, he becomes completely universal and acknowledges and recognizes that in a world in which no two leaves and no two snowflakes are identical, that is presumed by us, people of faith, to have been created by God, it would be odd indeed if there were only one path to God, which happens to coincide with the path that I call mine, which is my ego speaking. And so his encouragement to be universal and universalistic without denying what one is in a particularistic way is, of course, spectacularly relevant and important to the world in which we live today, a world which, in fact, at the moment, in the last 4, 5, 6 years, has been going backwards with respect to this sensibility in so many different places on the planet, where leaders and the followers who follow those leaders think in increasingly tiny ways about who and what is acceptable, rather than in a kind of universalistic way that Rumi would teach us. So that's my comment on your comment and your question.
Perfect. Yeah, and this is why I think it is so important for us to know ourselves first and to go inside and to find that treasure and to understand who we are. Because when we fail to do that, we do get small. I mean, it just, it's kind of counterintuitive, I guess. So I'm using my hands because it's a good visual, but you're going inside, so you're doing this, but actually when you do this inside, you're actually doing this on the outside. And we so need to work on ourselves first.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Sarah,
Yeah.
the word surrender is very central. And even during this presentation, you repeated a couple of times. But in your book, you also note that you are not encouraging anyone to escape. That's not the exact word, maybe, but or totally to collapse in the face of those annoyances. And you are with inspiration from Rumi, you're not calling people to fight, but simply to engage with that reality. So you are also highlighting that there is need for a balance when you say surrender or let it go or accept it as it is. So can you elaborate on that?
Sure. And like I said, this was like one of my biggest teaching lessons in life, is this surrender, because of my upbringing. I blame it on my upbringing. I'm the youngest of 5. And so I was kind of always, the little brat that nobody wanted to hang around, wanted hanging around. So I was, that shaped who I was and gave me, I think, a really strong personality of, well, oh yeah. And so to me, giving in and surrendering was to lose. It was to lose people. It was to lose contact. It was to lose what you wanted. And it took me very many years to understand that that's not what surrender is. It's about surrendering to what is. And that doesn't mean giving in or giving up. It simply means acceptance. And when you accept, and I'm not talking about accepting, I do make very clear in the introduction to this book, I have a section in here that just a paragraph in the introduction that just says, look, when I talk about surrendering and just accepting what is and that kind of thing, I do not mean abuse. If anybody is in an abusive situation, that's a completely, we don't accept abuse. So I do want to make that very clear. But it is about accepting that, you know what, we really are, the only thing we are in control of is ourselves, is our own emotions, our own reactions to things. Adults who have complete agency, over themselves. And so the surrendering really is, I've discovered, to my surprise, actually freeing. Whereas, I thought surrendering would be putting me in prison, but it actually freed me from the prison of my own false beliefs that surrender was a bad thing. And when I stopped trying to control the outcome or trying to control situations or even trying to control people and the way they behaved, my gosh, it was just like the earth sighed, And I think that it's a really important lesson. It just, just let it in and let it out. I think that line from a Beatles song, now that I mentioned that. So surrendering is not giving in and it's not giving up. It's actually the wisdom to know what you can control and what you can't control, and don't even go there with trying to control the things that are out of your control, because it's just not, that's just a recipe for misery. So I don't know if anybody else has had any issues with that, but I'll tell you, that's been that, and the whole control thing, which is related, was huge for me. And this place, nothing was what I expected ever. But when I stopped expecting and I was just like, okay, well, that person behaved that way. Okay. My little band of sheep, I had these 7 sheep that I was responsible for a while, and they kept escaping and it was driving me crazy. And at one point I'm like, okay, go into the other field and eat the grass there. I don't care. And it was great. Or, when things worked, when it poured freezing rain for days on end, which it did from time to time. When we lost our water, so we were living, the second year I was there were about 45 to 50 of us living in this community. Our well dried up. We lost water for 12 days. I mean, how do you bathe, and especially when you do ablutions multiple times a day before meditations, and cook and clean and do all these things without, how do you survive? You can't survive without water. That was a major surrender. And I just could see my evolution over time as like, when I first arrived there, I was like this, and because of the way certain things were. And then I was like, well, so the well dried up. guess we're going to have to, haul buckets of water to bathe in for 12 days. Okay, well, this is how we got to do that. So I recommend it. I recommend surrender.
Yeah, and you highlighted in very well, like surrender, but with agency. So that's, I think, where the balance is hit. And so just listening those memoir right now and having read the book, I've been to the barracks for 6 months in Turkey, where I was born. Military is based on conscription still, but your experience truly sounds to be harsher than mine.
A lot of people who've read the memoir have asked me, why on earth did you stay there for 2 years? But I hope that, but they also answered their own question because they could see the beauty. And Braemar truly does celebrate the beautiful. And I hope that you saw that in some of the images that I showed. The tables were always laid nicely with linen tablecloths and candelabra and flowers, and we ate the best food, the most organic, and food was prepared with love. The cooks had to say a prayer. There was a prayer posted in the kitchen, and they had to go say this prayer every time they went to prepare food, so as not to contaminate the meal with any bad stuff that they had going on with them. Whenever we did ablutions of the grounds in the house every Thursday. It was ablution day for everything. And if you were in a bad mood, you were not allowed to clean. You had to go to your room and say some wasifas and then come out and play, because that was the whole point. It was cleansing the mind and the body and the spirit. And that has a lot to do with surrendering too, again.
That convention sounds admittedly Sufi.
Yes.
We have 2 comments here.
Okay.
So Yasmin says about letting go. So true, letting go of expectations makes for a happier life. Thank you for elaborating on this. And Maria says, I lived next to the Capitol building and witnessed the insurrection. Rumi's The Guest House has been on my mind for the metaphor. So we have 5 more minutes. Maybe you want to reflect on those 2 comments.
Yes. Yeah. Well, Yasmin, I hope that you have found some happier life. It sounds like you have, by letting go of expectations. So, and it's an ongoing thing. I can't say that, I had this experience and now I'm perfect. I mean, this is, I look at my life now as a spiral rather than a, linear. I was here and now I'm here and now I'm here and now I'm here. I see life as a spiral. So you keep covering the same ground over and over again, but you see it from a different angle, from a different viewpoint, from a different height as you progress on that spiral. And that image is not my own. That was given to me by somebody who was counseling me, and it has stuck with me for years. And after this experience, I really got to see what she meant. It's like, yeah, I've been here before with my sheep escaping for the 50th time. I can continue to be upset about it, or I can move up the spiral and just see it from a different angle. And that's kind of what this whole book is about, is just, where are you on your spiral? So, and then in terms of the guest house, the guest house is one of my favorite poems. I'm not good enough to recite a snippet of that from memory, but if one of you is, Ori or Ibrahim, if you can recall a line from the guest house. I don't have my Rumi books on me. They're upstairs. And I don't think
I don't have mine on me, and I don't have it in my head.
But it's about leave this guest house if you can't behave.
Right.
If you're mean-spirited, leave. So Maria, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce your name. If you want to elaborate on that, feel free to come off mute. But you don't have to, no pressure. So, okay, well,
I can. It's just I don't know if my sound will be all
oh,
right.
you're good. You're good.
Okay. Well, it's an interesting poem about boundaries, but also so there's a part of don't come in if you're mean spirited, but Rumi also suggests let them in, let them break everything up, and I saw that as a metaphor, obviously not condoning the violence of the insurrection, but also what in the house needs to be looked at and why do they have to come in violently in the first place? You know,
Yeah.
it's a reciprocal relationship if we're going to move towards healing. And I think that that poem really resonates with that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it was on my mind because no, I
Mm-hmm.
don't want you to come into Congress and beat everything up and kill people. Of course not. But why was the rage there? And I know we could talk for hours about the spiritual depth that Rumi could provide.
Yep.
Insight to let go of the ego and to really begin that conversation that bridges the divide.
Mm-hmm. You know, for me, I think when I think about this violence and these unpleasant, to say the least, things that are going on in this world, I think about what it means to have to radically love. And for me, that's how I interpret radical love, is to love the radicals. Maybe you could say it that way too. You know, for me, my challenge now is I'm challenging myself to listen to other people and to hear what they're saying and to try and understand their pain. Not that I can do anything about it necessarily, but for me, that's radical love. And that's a big leap for me, is to be able to love and accept these people with whom I am just polar opposites with. And so there's a good talk about radical love. I think there's a Rumi on the Rumi Forum YouTube website. Who is the gentleman who teaches at Duke?
So we have Abdullah Antepli, who
No, Omid Safi.
Omid Safi, yeah.
Yes, Omid Safi.
Yeah.
He talks about radical
keynote.
love.
Yeah, he was our keynote.
Yes, thank you. He's got some really good, there's a very good video that he did several years ago for the Rumi Forum. I think it was dated from like 2012 or something. It was quite a few years ago, but it's very good. And he talks about this concept of radical love.
That's 2012, and it's one of the most popular videos on our YouTube channel. I encourage everyone to have a look at it.
Yes, yeah, I do too. Well, let me share my screen again really quickly, and I can we'll get to this slide. So here is, again, my website, and I believe, Ibrahim, you had put it in the chat as well. And here is the information about if you would like to get a signed copy of either of my books. They're available from this bookstore or from me directly. So you can feel free to contact them. And feel free to reach out to me too. I am available for group discussions. If you want to read either of these books, I'm available for group discussions, public or private. On my website, you can download some study guide questions for both of these books. And I'm available for speaking and storytelling events as well. So I want to thank you. I think we're just about a minute over time. I want to thank you all for coming again tonight. Blessings on your journey, and thank you so much for allowing me to share my experience with you. And again, feel free to reach out to me directly if you need.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Sarah, for this great conversation, and looking forward to meeting at our next event, which will be our 4th session of scriptural reasoning. And that's on the 11th of March. So enjoy the rest of your evening, and stay safe, stay well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Bye. Everybody flowing off here.